Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Talking Insights. I'm your host, Antonio. And today joining us, we have Jon Cohen, CEO and founder of Kindling EVA, and Saul Cohen, the company's co-founder and head of product. Together with their team of emotion scientists and developers, they spent 2 years researching what was missing from existing AI emotion analytics before building a new model designed to better understand how people really feel. The work has already been applied by global brands, including Sky, Unilever, Kellanova, Burnett, and so many others. And they help them create products and communications that connect more effectively with their audiences. Jon is also the author of Asking for Trouble, a book exploring how we can better understand human responses and behavior. As you will hear on this conversation, Jon is an expert on understanding the emotions, the human emotions, and how people really are feeling. And this episode really touches on that, how AI can understand the human emotion, how today models are good at analyzing texts and patterns, but are they really good at the human feelings? So it's a very interesting conversation. It's something that really makes you think on how you're using technology and how you're approaching your work. And I hope you learn something new. So Jon and Saul, take it away. So Jon and Saul, it's great to have you both. Welcome to Talking Insights. Okay. All right. Jon and Saul, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here and thanks for your time to do this. I know that you're super busy. You have like a super interesting company and it touches a bit on like emotion and AI. And that's what I want to start with. And that's because everyone's kind of talking about AI and how AI is becoming more human. From your perspective, can AI kind of really understand the human emotion, or is it just simply recognizing patterns?
That's an amazing question. Jon, do you want to take it?
Why don't you go? The answer to that is, I think
this is right up my alley.
We started our journey, didn't we? So we probably answered that is probably not, and now the answer to that is probably yes.
All right.
Yeah. So I think that's right. I think what Jon's describing, Antonio, is the trend that has gone on across multiple industries, across multiple AI industries, which is, the improvement seems to be exponential on some metrics, right? And that's definitely something that we've seen happen. I think there's maybe a bigger question underlying whether or not, AI or machines can really understand human emotion. And I think that question is, how well do we understand emotion from the get-go as well, right? And I think once we answer the question, if we answer the question of how we want to think about emotion, it really helps deal with the question of how you can then, train a machine to understand emotion. And that's very much fundamental in what we've built our business around, is trying to understand emotion in kind of a very human way. That's Jon's background, right? Is understanding emotion. People are very good at understanding emotion. And actually, so the principle of what we're trying to do is emulate how people understand emotion. And I think that's interesting.
I love that.
Think about it. That's context.
Yeah. When I was doing a little research for this episode, I came across a few emotions that I think are kind of harder to understand, like sarcasm, sometimes surprise, or even those subtle emotion cues. Is AI getting better at understanding this, or is it still very difficult for it?
And it's such a brilliant question. And I think the answer is twofold. Firstly, it's about what measurement streams and what data streams you're taking into account. If you just use text, which is what, LLMs do, there's a limit to how well and how accurately those systems will ever perform at understanding the kind of nuance and complexity of emotion. So that's the first answer to the question, and our business is built around that idea. We use many different data streams, all integrated. That's the first part of that question. But the second part is that when you mention nuanced emotions like, sarcasm, I think is a beautiful example. And that's a really good example of an emotion that you can't necessarily just pick out through text either. You kind of really have to have tone and facial expression intertwined there. But I think what you see happen with a lot of other companies that do something similar to us, they fail at a point where those emotions aren't even being measured in the first place. So if you only have, most measurement systems, 1-dimensional, 2-dimensional, sometimes 6-dimensional. So 6 basic emotions. And, so you're talking about fear, disgust, anger, but that doesn't capture sarcasm. And if some sarcasm lives somewhere amongst those, and you can say it sits here, it still doesn't really mean anything for clients. So the question that you have to answer before you answer the question of how do we make AI understand what sarcasm is and how to read sarcasm, we have to be able to say, okay, this is what sarcasm is, and this is where sarcasm sits in the space, and this is what sarcasm looks like. And so there's this really interesting kind of fact of what we have to assess first. But actually, yeah, the answer is what we do. Certainly, we detect sarcasm as its own individual metric. So
if you think about emotions, what makes us human and what makes emotions interesting is that they are complex and they are multi-layered, and they are often, very importantly, context dependent. So, sarcasm is a sarcastic response to something. So you go, how do you feel about this idea? You go, yeah, I love it. And actually it's kind of, I love it. It really does exactly what I wanted to do. I'll give you a really good example where we do a lot of work with trains. Okay, trains have this problem. They do a lot of, so the rail companies, the big rail companies, especially in the UK, they do a lot of social media tracking, for example. And a lot of people say, I had a great experience on trains today. And especially in Britain, they're being sarcastic. And what it's reading is what their social media tracking is doing is picking up this and understanding it as a positive response. If you, for example, do something, another really interesting emotion is nostalgia. Nostalgia is an extremely complicated emotion. It's got an awful lot going on. But both with those examples with nostalgia and sarcasm, what's important to remember is that there are a lot of other things happening at the same time. So if you're truly understanding emotion, for example, how you feel about your parents, or how you feel about your upbringing, or how you feel about McDonald's because you had it when you were a child, chicken McNuggets, which is something you have as you're a kid, but you sort of grow out of. You don't just experience nostalgia any more than you just experience fear or anger or love or like. And I think the challenge for AI has been, and the kind of the opportunity as well. And the really interesting thing is that all of these emotions are happening at the same time, and they're happening continuously, and they change, and they're context dependent. And it's the richness and the complexity and the depth of emotion that makes us human. And as moderators and as qual researchers, that's what makes our job interesting, is understanding and unpicking those layers and then doing it across numbers of people. So then if you have 10 people, they're all saying different things at different times. And that I think that the journey that AI is on is it's quite easy for AI to segment answers, to go, 10 people said this, and therefore I'm going to give you a combined answer, and this is how they feel about your idea. But they don't really.
Yeah.
And what AI is doing, and the journey we're on certainly, is unpicking all of those elements so that you get a true and proper understanding of how people feel.
That actually leads to kind of my next question, because you were saying something about context, and it's so important nowadays to have context, especially with emotions. And I was going to ask about the cultural and the individual differences from all of these people, because again, like you can have 10 people, but then they can be from different cultures, different backgrounds, different everything. Everyone's different. Do you think that AI, or is there a danger for AI to become too good at recognizing just the average or just like the normal, and then it misses on all of these things that makes us human,
Absolutely.
Oh, you take it. Do you want to take the sort of technical answer, and I'll give you
sure.
the over-emotional qual research answer?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So I think there absolutely is a fear and a danger of that. And actually, there has to be very conscious design of AI systems to avoid that. And that really, the fundamental base of that is the training data. And so if you are, one question we get a lot from our clients is, does it work in multiple markets, right? Can you do the same study in India as you can do in the UK? Because, facial expressions might be different, that sort of thing. And so actually the research that we rely on and the training data that we rely on in the AI systems we use is fundamentally based around what emotions are naturally recognized cross-culturally. So, we actually very much, the focus of our modeling is specifically on the fact that it has to be better than not just recognizing the average, but the second thing that you have to do there as well is from training data, you don't then just get a working system. The next thing you need to do is you need to decide how you deal with statistical outliers so as to be able to build a system that's robust to be able to handle those sorts of edge cases, which you might not think are frequent. And that, and in emotional science, that's incredibly pertinent because a lot of people, some people might be a lot more enthusiastic, a lot more smiley than others, right? And you need to be able to model for that both on the client side, but also in the modeling side of when you're even building those AI systems. So that's the technical perspective. And then for the over emotional qual perspective, I'll leave it to Jon.
First thing I would say on it is that, that the big challenge is actually, I think, really the dumbing down of emotions. So what's happening, as all described, is actually it's like saying you understand emotions by identifying 6 different emotions. It's like that's not emotion. So I think what we do is we have the full spectrum of human emotions across multimodalities, and I think we're actually picking up emotion. I think that's the start point. In terms of what happens when you aggregate that, there's a couple of things I would say. The first is that it depends how you present the data. So if you're presenting the data as this is what people says and the aggregate score is this, that's one piece of data and that's valid. And we find that and clients find that hugely helpful. But alongside that, you say, this is why people felt that way. This is what happened. And also some people said this. So I think it comes back to the way it's just about, because you could argue the same thing always happened with qual and particularly quant research, is you give people an answer. And that answer, to some extent, especially if it's an aggregate score, is still a kind of, like you say, that average. I think as long as you're presenting you to your clients and you're saying to people, but interestingly, somebody said this, or that's driving the response, then that's all that matters. And on that, I always talk about this. I've trained lots of people. I've been lucky enough to train a lot of people in how to think about research, and I've written a book about it over the year. And, I always say, for example, if we talk to people about, what do young men in China feel about their skin? And we talk to 20 young men in China, we don't understand how young men in China feel about their skin, because there's how many of them? There's 400 million young men in China, and we've talked to 20 of them. You could do quant research and you could do 200 of them. You still wouldn't know. So what I always talk about is humility. And I think the problem with AI and a lot of new technologies is that people then think they have the answer. As long as you respect, as long as you respect the numbers and you talk about it with humility, you're fine. So you say, from the people we spoke to, this is how they feel, and that will enable us to make better decisions. Then you're in a really good place. If you think from talking to people, you have absolute certainty, clarity of the answer, and you kind of, therefore you understand all people and how they feel, then you get what's coming to you.
I think that's really wise. And I think I would just add to that, there's a massive tendency, particularly amongst a lot of peers and people I speak to who are much more into the data side, to say that when the sample size or the data set gets big enough, you've got certainty. Actually, in qual research and actually in most things, that doesn't really bear out as true at all. And I think that's really brilliantly put by Jon. And I think so, indications and indicators and humility are key. But I think the other thing that also is critical also in our business process, and I think Jon's alluding to there, is also human oversight. People use this phrase human in the loop, which I actually hate, because I don't think it should even be this sort of loop. It should be human oversight at every step. And we've got validation checks on every step, every single input piece of data on every single project and every single output. So nothing is automated in this sort of traditional insight sense. The insight's still coming from people, right? It's the methodologies that are changing and modifying, and the measurements that are modifying. But the human input is still essential in that story. And I think it's critical for this element of humility and also trust.
I think back at the end of the day is like, it's an evolution. It's a new technology. It's a new way to do things. But, as was the email, as was the fax, it's just
Absolutely.
a new way to do things. You just need to know how to use it.
Yep.
And that kind of leads to my next question, which was, I know you don't have like a crystal ball. Everyone would love to have a crystal ball, but how do you see this kind of emotion analytics changing, especially in market research, or the way that it's conducted in the next 5 years? And as Jon, you were saying about like the Chinese story about the young man in China, it kind of reminded me about this term that everyone's kind of keep talking about, the synthetic personas and the AI synthetic personas. How do you see the personas in all of this, and how do you see this evolving in the next 5 years?
Wow. So synthetic personas is one thing. So evolution in the next 5 years. Honestly, how do I talk about this without sounding like an old man? So I've seen the, I've kind of been around for a while, and I've seen kind of mobile technology introduced to market research, which fundamentally changed it. The internet, I built a business off that, and I was lucky enough to exit that as well, the internet and so on. So I've been through these kind of cycles of technology on a couple of occasions already. And I think that ultimately it will, that was such a rubbish answer, but the smart will survive. I mean, that's the way, if people who adapt and embrace the new technologies and build it into their systems and understand how to use it will do great. And I think, and the market research industry will do great, and it will thrive, and it will use AI as a tool. And actually, I think that whilst, Anthropic, I think it was put market research, it's 7th out of 500 of industries most at risk from AI. And, or maybe it was 7 out of 100. I don't know exact, but, really vulnerable. I'm more positive and optimistic about the future. Because I think ultimately our job as researchers is to understand people, and we are better at understanding people than machines. And we will be using things like our tool, Kindling EVA, to facilitate, to help our job, to make us better at it. Human emotions are extremely complicated, and the more help we can get, the better. And ultimately our purpose is to develop products that better meet people's emotional needs, because that's what drives us. That's what drives our behavior, and that's what drives our purchase decisions. And therefore, if we can use a machine and machine learning to help us do that, then we drive the development of more meaningful products and solutions. That can only be a good thing. So I don't see our role as being diminished, and I don't see the role of humans within that being diminished, even if we're using brilliant tools to help us. Synthetic respondents, this is purely a personal point of view. I have more of an issue with, because just philosophically, what is the point? If your job as a market researcher is fundamentally to understand people, to understand their needs, what drives them, what matters to them, then I have an underlying issue with you using non-real people to do that. I think you're missing the point of your job. Yeah. Now, that's not to say that they won't do it extremely well. It won't enable clients and companies to develop products more cheaply, to effectively reduce the cost of and value of market research within their organizations, make it generic, iron out all the intricacies. I can see all kinds of benefits for clients, but I have an underlying fundamental issue of, if you go into market research and insight to understand people and you're using synthetic respondents, then to me, you're missing the point of your job. But then, hey, that's what I've made my career out of, and I believe in the power of people. So I would say that.
Maybe we need to add like a little tag, made by humans. This research was made by humans.
And as I said, that's not to say I'm techno. Yeah, it's very easy when you say that kind of thing. You feel like you're being a luddite or you're being techno. When I build businesses based on tech, we're building a business now based on tech. But I think there is a fundamental truth that sits underneath that, which is that people matter.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with John more. I think from a core research perspective as well, that is super compelling. I just think the one thing I would add there is, I think the fear that you described of collapsing everything into the middle, all response looks the same. I think that becomes really dangerous when we're talking about synthetic respondents, because then you're using synthetic measurement, you're using artificial measurement with synthetic respondents, and it sounds like a synthetic death spiral, model collapse. And I think it's definitely threatening also just to the progression actually of the same AI systems that we're talking about as being helpful.
But I talked to a client yesterday who's trialing it for the first time, and they're blown away by it. So, I'm sure you could get somebody who will tell you the opposite and all the benefits. And I've got no doubt that they're also right.
Yeah. There's always two sides of a coin, right? To finish it up, I have one last question. We have some research listening. We have CEOs. We have people that are just entering the industry now. If you could share like one piece of advice on how to incorporate emotion, AI into their work, what would that advice be?
Paul, do you have it?
Come and talk to us.
Yeah, great answer.
Read your book.
I think the thing that I would say is assess the need. So as we said from the beginning here, people are very good at understanding emotion, and researchers are very good at understanding emotion. And I think the use comes in when you're looking for a kind of level of analytics that takes it to a whole nother level, where it's really starting to feel like a science, not just a core research debrief that feels like this very scientific element. And that for clients can feel really, really, really valuable if they are trying to compete and maintain a competitive edge. I think when we're talking about for everyday people, I think the first place to start is by getting good at understanding people. And that's what John's background is. John's background is understanding people, and people are really good at understanding people. And I think the tools are out there for expression measurement, but the need is primarily to understand people. If the need for that is only growing, that would be my perspective. John, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah. So my advice on it is really clear, which circles back to where you started, Antonio, which was such a great question, for example, around sarcasm. So to me, my advice would be there are a lot of people going to tell you that they do emotion, that they analyze emotion, and they could tell you how people feel about your ideas. My advice would be to ask them, can they really? Because frankly, you can't do, excuse the language, you can't do emotion half-assed. If somebody says something and you don't get that they're being sarcastic, you don't just make poor decisions, you actually make the wrong decisions. If you are making development decisions about products, communications, experiences, if you're trying to develop products that meet people's emotional needs and you only understand a limited set of emotions, then you're going to make really bad decisions. But when those people and the whole market is telling you, we understand emotions, our AI will tell you how they feel about ideas, I would ask the question, can they? I would look beneath the bonnet. And if they're testing it based on 6 emotions, if they're using sentiment, if they're only using LLMs, they're not understanding emotions. So do it. Do the research, great, but also come and talk to us.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, and as you were saying, like, I feel it goes back to the human and the machine. Like, if the human is oversimplifying the emotions, then the machine will just feed on whatever the human is saying. So, it goes back to you. Like, if you need to understand the emotions,
Absolutely.
everything that you're doing, and then the machine can help you do your work. And it goes back to the whole fax, email. It's a tool. If you know how to do your work, it will highlight it, make it better and everything. But if your emotions are just sad and happy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
I think that's exactly what we think.
I love it.
That's exactly how we think about it.
Yeah.
It's putting people first as well.
Yeah.
It's putting people
I
first,
agree.
which if you do core research, that should be central to your mission.
There you go.
It's about people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there you go. So, Jon, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for the conversation. I think there's a lot of people listening that are going to learn a lot on, not only learn, but also like look inside and think that, is this the way that I should be doing the things? Should I just step back and overthinking again? Like, think twice, how are all the things that I'm doing? So yeah, thank you so much for the conversation. And thank you so much for being here.
Great. Great questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your time.
And that's all for today, folks. Talking Insights is a production of Research World and SMR, bringing you the stories, voices, and ideas shaping the insights community around the world. If you'd like to be featured in a future episodes, share your story, or learn more about sponsoring opportunities, send us an email at podcast@smr.org. And don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. And join us next week for another great conversation. See ya.